Hello, everyone. My name is Abby Lehman with L3 Harris Geospatial, and we're back to a brand new season of geospatial distancing. Since we last spoke in June, the hot mess that we know as 2020 has continued to rage on. But on a positive note, we held our first virtual NV Analytics Symposium in August. And if you attended EAS this year, then you'll probably recognize both of the panelists on today's episode. First up, we have Dr. Jonathan Fentzke with Techstars. And we also have Dan Gruidel, who's my colleague at L3 Harris Geospatial. So I approached Jonathan mere minutes after his EAS presentation ended to invite him to join Geospatial Distancing. Not familiar with the show, he warned me that his ideas have been characterized as rebellious within the geospatial community. So I, in turn, wasted absolutely no time in putting him on the schedule. Now, before we dive into today's discussion, let's cover some basics. First, a reminder that to interact with our panelists and to ask questions, just use the Q&A button that's along the bottom of your Zoom interface. And as always, my trusty colleague, Matria Grazing, will be monitoring questions as they come in and directing them to our panel. Say hi, Mott.
Hi.
Like someone was on mute. So another quick reminder that yes, a recording of this episode will be made available. You'll get an email at the end. And lastly, just to throw in a pinch of, CYA, please remember that the opinions expressed during geospatial distancing are that of the individual expressing them and do not necessarily reflect the views of L3 Harris or its subsidiaries, affiliates, interns, childhood friends, or family pets. Good? All right, great. With that, I'll do a full intro to our panelists today. So first up, as I said, Dr. Jonathan Fentzke. He is the Managing Director for the Techstars Allied Space Accelerator. His PhD is in aerospace engineering, and in a previous life, he founded and also co-founded companies like OmniEarth and InSpace. Now, he's an experienced entrepreneur and investor focused on remote sensing and geospatial analytics. Thanks for joining us, Jonathan.
Thank you so much for that kind intro.
Next up, welcome again, Dan Gruidel. He is Director of Commercial Solutions at L3 Harris Geospatial. He's a Colorado native, and if you remember, he's a father of 5. And after reading a LinkedIn post, he actually played a pretty key role in bringing Jonathan to EAS as a speaker. So thanks for joining us today, Dan.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, thank you for having me. And thank you, Jonathan, for joining. Always look forward to your insights and opinions. Looking forward to today.
Yeah, super excited to be here with you guys. Great.
So now we can go ahead and dive into the discussion. I think we've covered all our bases. I'm going to start with Jonathan because, the whole episode is around this concept of GeoOps. And it was also the focus of your EAS presentation, but the concept is not widely known within the industry. Can you give us a quick rundown on what you mean when you refer to GeoOps?
Oh, definitely. And I would ask Dan or anybody else to cut me off if I get a little too pedantic. But as a scientist, I like to always start with first principles. So for geospatial distancing today, we're going to do a little history lesson. First, I would submit to you that technology is just the current state of knowledge in society. So if you buy that, that will give us a bridge to what GeoOps means today. Again, I'm going to digress for one moment on a vignette. What does technology actually mean? Greek, techne, right? It's an art, or cunning is my favorite thing, kind of the current element of knowledge. And logia, right? It's kind of a systematic approach to understanding. So if we think about it in that framework and we apply it then to geospatial, say, hey, what's the current state of knowledge in geo? Well, we know as GIS professionals, practitioners, scientists, and software engineers, that there are lots of tools out there, right? That's just the application of technology. But what we've seen over the last 5 years or so, if you want to stretch it, folks that have been in the business for a long time, let's give it a solar cycle, 11 years. We've seen cloud and these developments that make it easier to access and exchange information. And so what has that created? It's created infrastructure, right? Infrastructure is basically taking stuff that's hard and making it easy. So just like we've had DevOps for those that are sort of into the cloud, we're now seeing things like AI ops and GeoOps. And what that is really the infrastructure around using geospatial information and then improving decisions. And so I'll dig into some other elements of history and philosophy around GeoOps, but if you think about it as just making things easier to use geospatial information, to make decisions, you understand GeoOps implicitly.
Nope, Abby, we can't hear you.
See, can you tell I'm a little bit rusty? That's what happens when you go away for a few months. You start leaving the mute button on. Okay, so Dan, what I was trying to ask is, when you read the LinkedIn post that kind of led you to asking him to join EAS, was it about GeoOps or was it something completely different?
I think there was a little bit of GeoOps to it, and Jonathan and his background and his interest in space and solutions that are helping us get to answers using geospatial information is kind of what jumped out to me. The GeoOps to me is also interesting to me, and I think our organization or anybody involved in our industry, because I like the foundation you laid, Jonathan, because as business people and or entrepreneurs, we're looking at using the things available to us to solve problems, maybe make some money ideally, right? And so we kind of get on a trajectory, but you have to use the tools that are at your disposal today. But to do so, you have to have a vision of where you can take it. And technology kind of helps us bridge that gap to what we see out in the future and where we are today. And so the GeoOps to me plays a big role in geospatial data, period, in a couple things. One, to the industries that already use geospatial information, tools like we have Envy, for instance, other applications that are out there. But what's interesting to me is we have our historical companies that use these tools that are geospatial oriented. Their business is geospatial. The GeoOps maybe helps us get to new industries that aren't necessarily geospatial born or trained. They know they have geospatial problems, but they don't really know how to solve them. And I think that's where GeoOps can play a role.
Yeah, and if I may make my first controversial statement, to be a little bit of a poking the bear, I would submit to you that geospatial is not special. Many people who are in GIS or geospatial or geography or even human geo, they think of it as very special silo. But if we look back in history, you'll find so many examples that define our society as a geospatial focused society, whether it's explorers trying to circumnavigate the globe, or one of my favorite examples of Eratosthenes, Sagan has a great quote where he's trying to figure out the distance between two cities in Egypt using the shadow angle, right? Using geometry, trigonometry, and other things. We've evolved to the point where it's software, right? And by definition, if it's in software, it means it's not special because we understand it to a level where we can automate it and put it in computers and then get answers from questions.
Yeah, I have a question for you in that. So a lot of times when we talk about innovation, some people think of obsolescence, that now all of a sudden, because you've automated some of my geospatial data or other information using software, that we're perhaps going to lose jobs. What's your kind of vision in that topic?
Ooh, that's almost like a trap. I like that trap that you've set. I would submit again to the audience and to this group that it's an evolution. So just like products, right? A product life cycle, for anybody who's used products, they know, like for example, we've had Razor phones, flip phones. They came up, they went down, then we got iPhones, right? It didn't mean people lost jobs, the technology just evolved. 80% of jobs in the US were farming jobs a few hundred years ago. We still have employment today. It's an evolution, right? It's economically specialization. So I would say as the tools improve, our ability to do new and better things with those tools actually makes those people who understand the tools and the discipline that much more valuable. Rather than obsolescence, I would actually think it's elevating the skill set and making it more obvious the value. Like again, Uber didn't realize they were a geospatial analytics business when they started, right? They thought they were moving people around in fancy cabs. It's actually a geospatial analytics business. So I think that becomes more obvious to companies with time.
Yeah.
You mentioned Uber too, and I'm wondering, are there any other examples? Like how can you help people understand what would this actually look like, a future that's more shaped by GeoOps? What does that look like?
Okay, so I'm gonna go back in time for a moment, and then I'm gonna spring forward. If you go back in time, again, using the idea of the Greeks, you have technology, techne, and then you have a thing called episteme. And this framework of knowledge is one about rote learning and what's assumed to be true. I would encourage everybody to go read some Michel Foucault, the French philosopher that talks about the archaeology of knowledge and this. So with that framework, what we have to understand about GeoOps is things that we took for granted or that we assumed were hard in the past, right? Like just collecting geospatial data, putting it in a hard drive, sending it to somebody else to collaborate was hard. Again, Eric Gunderson, great quote from Mapbox, right? It's a bad API. FedEx is a bad API, right? So what that means today is that with this new infrastructure, you can invite more people in to help you solve problems because you don't have as many, you don't need as many PhDs, right? You can use software engineers or other non-technical folks to integrate different data sets to build algorithms on top of it. And it's a great foundation. So if you look to the future, you will start to see more and more apps in phones, more and more cloud-based solutions that use reasoning, logic, automation, process optimization with geospatial data, where they just never could use it before as an input because it was just like, square peg, round hole. It was just too hard to use.
I have a question related to that, Jonathan. So is I'll call it architecture and technology comes together to kind of help with that automation. How do you trust the answer? We spend a lot of time with our customers, right? And we embrace science, and scientific answers is, foundational to what we do in our business. But as people who aren't familiar with the data types and the output, if you will, as we start to get into this GeoOps world where we're smoothing out, those bumps and things, and we'll be getting efficiencies, how do you trust it?
So this is a great question. Historically, trust and transparency are intimately linked, right? Used to call this, or I call it, physically verifiable data. Just like you can look at an image and you can say, okay, that's water, that's land, that's a car, that's a bridge, that's a parking lot with your eyeballs, right? You're asking, well, how do I trust the machines or the AI or the algorithms to produce meaningful data? That's transparency. How do we build transparency into our systems? This is where GeoOps shines, right? Metadata storage, being backwards compatible, versioning of models, so that if somebody questions the result, it can be traced back to the source, right? And so I think a lot of the infrastructure that's being created today by many software developers and geospatial analysts and others is how to create transparency in algorithmic approaches. This helps us trust it, and it prevents the proliferation of Skynet or some sentient being, right, whose intentions we don't know.
I love the Skynet. Thank you. It's nice when you can weave that in.
Yeah. Well, people are afraid of automation in some cases, and they don't trust, especially GIS analysts who are very used to being hands-on. But again, I go back to what is infrastructure? Well, electricity was technology. People didn't trust it. There was, as we all know, cattle prodding going on, all kinds of other things to create distrust. Fast forward, we take it for granted that anywhere you go, you have electricity. So in the same way we trust Google Maps or other geospatial technologies to get us from point A to point B, I believe that enterprises and individuals will continue to accept automation and optimization around geospatial analytics, because the algorithms will get good and you can prove it. Here's how long it takes to do by hand. Here's the data you get. If the variance is small enough, you're willing to accept a little bit of an issue, and knowing that it'll get better. That's called a knowledge system or a learning system, right? We're just in that process today.
Interesting. You make me think of another question. Abby, jump in. I know you have some questions for us too.
No worries. No worries.
Do you believe then, as we move towards this future of GeoOps, that there will be a director of GeoOps, and that's kind of the future of geospatial and education? Is the semblance more like computer science versus geospatial?
Well, and this actually came up during the wonderful conference that I was invited to previously, is what is the future of work? What are the job titles or the roles that are going to evolve? There was no chief information officer in companies 50 years ago, right? Even the idea of a CTO has evolved over time. And I think as it relates to geospatial, you will start to see GeoOps, this blending, this coming together of different disciplines in computer science, in geospatial information systems, and in IT or some variant thereof, software or computer engineering, that role will be, how do I help my organization? How do I help my colleagues to leverage the infrastructure more efficiently, right? And that can be on the desktop, that can be on mobile, or in cloud-based platforms that get accessed, in systems you don't even see, where things are running in the background. So that will create new jobs and new roles as technology becomes more tightly integrated in the enterprise.
I had a great question, Dan, and now I totally am spacing it, of course, because, oh, I know what it was. So, so tell me, Jonathan, what do you see as the biggest roadblock to this transition happening right now? Like, what needs to happen for this to actually move forward? Get ready for the controversy. Good, let's go. Let's hear it.
We need to have a re-education of a lot of the, let's say, robots. And what I mean by that is people who have been trained to think a certain way, right, using legacy tools and techniques, need to then figure out, oh, how can I educate, inform, and apply my knowledge, right? The experience you have, the intuition you've built is the integral of experiential learning. How do you apply that experience, the human in the loop, to these new software systems? Because many software engineers and computer scientists can compile software, but just because you can compile it doesn't make it correct. So we really need a re-education and a collaboration between, let's say, heritage, old school, regular enterprise platform technologies that have been around for decades, with the new school algorithmic approaches, and then hopefully, just like new music that's being created from different genres, you'll get a better outcome. It'll be more interesting anyway.
Got it. Robots, Terminator, any other scary robot references you want to make?
No, I think more about like Rosie, the wonderful robot in the Jetsons, right? I'm more on the friendly side of things. I have a sort of realistic view of the future, which is positive.
Well, I mean, it sounds to me like when you were trying to explain this concept to me, which in fairness took longer than it probably would for other people in the industry, just because I'm in marketing. But when you were explaining to me, you were describing a lot of stuff that feels familiar to the technology we use now. Like you said, Uber, you were talking about, public works and distributing information that way. What is the difference? Is it just more that it's more widespread in the future,
yeah.
Or?
Like any good orator, I'll take a question and return a question, which is, what's the difference between writing code on a command line, or Pine, the old email system in the command line, versus Gmail or Outlook or whatever? It's how you integrate the technologies and how you make it more accessible and easier to use. The goal, I think, is transitioning from specialist, discipline-specific geospatial analytics to a wider use, let's call it open innovation ecosystem, where you don't have to be trained in the discipline for years or decades to be able to create a useful outcome from the tools you have. So
Dan,
democratization.
Yeah, Dan, I'm curious too, even within our organization, that we hear about this transition all the time from software to, SaaS, software as a service. Do you see this kind of taking place now?
Yeah, I think that's where we're headed. Answers as a service, right? And we're lucky to have Jonathan. Jonathan brings a new angle and education level to dissecting this topic. One of the things I think about in regards to technology, and I'm going to go back to my baseball days, and it's a good time to bring this one up. If you watch baseball and if you're a baseball fan, there's a position called the catcher. And the way you know they're a good catcher is you don't see them. You don't notice them. They're behind there. The system's running smooth. The pitcher's doing his job, and he's invisible. And I think that's what you're looking for. When Jonathan mentioned Pine and email, right? Ease of use and stuff that we don't notice becomes critical for us to get to that next stage. So like the catcher, you want it to kind of be invisible. And so you're just kind of doing it, right? You're not tripping over it. You don't have to break your laptop because it doesn't work. It works. It's easy to do. It's accessible, right? So GeoOps, dealing with that. Or companies like ourselves that are building solutions and entrepreneurs that are part of Techstars. A lot of what we're looking to do is how do we make those things easier to use and get an answer you can trust.
So I'm going to pause for a second because we do have some questions that came in. Matria?
So one of the questions we received are, what are the examples of prospective industries that apply to the concept of GeoOps, and where might the transition be seen in the sales cycle?
Ooh, good question. Dan, you want to take that one, or is that for me?
I may have to have it repeated. That was meaty.
Sure. What are examples of prospective industries that apply to the concept of GeoOps, and where might the transition be seen in a sales cycle?
I'll take that one, and then Jonathan, jump in with yours. So I have a background coming out of energy industries and software that apply to that. GeoOps or geospatial scientists are generally not employed in a lot of these industries, right? So they really rely on software to help deliver an answer. A practical application is one we're working on now, where if you take imagery of assets on poles in the utility industry and you automate that, and you can detect anomalies or degradation of the asset that could cause a blackout, the automation behind that becomes a GeoOps opportunity where you could get a signal that the asset's bad, trigger an alert or a work order for somebody to go out and fix it. Now, where it's at in its sales cycle or market adoption, it's early, because a lot of these industries don't necessarily understand or have that background that we've been talking about in geospatial technology. So they really rely on vendors and experts like ourselves to help them recognize there's a GeoOps opportunity here that can reduce costs, provide better efficiencies and safety. So that's one example. And I think a lot of physical asset industries are going to start to look at that as more imagery and data, Internet of Things starts to come on board. There's always going to be a bit of geospatial data in that.
Yeah, and you know, this, just for background, again, this idea of GeoOps I came to learn about it from a friend and dear colleague, Dr. Shadron Strong. She was building application-specific geospatial analytic pipelines for our customers at my last startup. And it became clear to her that there was all these different tools floating around. And if we could integrate them, right, and then automate them, we'd be able to make better, faster, higher value decisions for our customers. And I've seen this play out, of course, in energy, in infrastructure monitoring, you know, very clearly, right? When you're looking at like corridor monitoring, right of ways, other things, very boring stuff, right? Where it takes lots of people and time and equipment to go do it by hand, when clearly you could use a multispectral image or a SAR image or just even GPS data or other things. But you have to have an understanding of the problem. That's part of why we're early in the sales cycle. Enterprise has to acknowledge they have a problem. Like Ray Dalio says, great entrepreneur from Bridgewater, and folks, you have to admit you have a problem, then you can solve it with people, process, and technology. So in the industry, we've usually used people. We've evolved to using better processes with our people and our enterprise software systems. And now we're moving more towards technology to automate our understanding of the problem, to deliver answers at the point of need. And you see it across, I mean, obviously D&I in the defense domain, energy, infrastructure. But again, we're all just people going grocery shopping, right? Clearly somebody automated an algorithm to do least time, least distance between 2 points, right? That's how we have this beautiful Google Maps thing with directions. That's GeoOps, right? But we take it as infrastructure. So some level has already been created of acceptance of this framework, but it's popularizing and explaining what it is so people are excited about it, and they understand how to leverage it.
And we have, actually, speaking of infrastructure, we do have one more question. It actually showed up in the chat. Matria, do you want to give that to them?
Sure. So someone had posted that in their world, geospatial information is critical to the protection of critical infrastructure. For example, managing the effects of a major hazardous material incident. How do you see GeoOps in that context?
So this is a great example of a decision chain, right? So if you have some, let's call it hazardous material or something which is deemed to be dangerous, then clearly it needs to be monitored and then to be actioned upon if some state change occurs, whether it's an anomaly detection or whether it's a rise above a certain density in a volume or whatever the case may be. And so in GeoOps, the nominal infrastructure is you have a pre-processor step where you make your variables that you want to monitor, and then you have your sensors that monitor those variables. They go into a workflow, and instead of necessarily having people go out and check the boxes, you have an algorithm which says, based on my sensors and this set of rules, I'm going to notify somebody if something changes, right? And so what I just described in words, you can put in software and put remote sensing systems in place and algorithms to do that. And then, of course, there's a human in the loop checking or monitoring it. It's not like it runs completely autonomously. But in most large industries, there's so many places to check. Like, again, let's talk about pipelines and leaks. There's just too many thousands of miles of pipelines to be able to look everywhere all the time. But with IoT, with remote sensing, and with geo analytics and GeoOps, we get much better, more efficient coverage and insights, which keeps people safer and the environment healthier.
And Dan, before I dive into any more questions, do you have anything else too? I feel like your questions are equally as good as mine, so I want to make sure to give the chance.
I think Jonathan nailed it for that answer, right? But I think what also needs to be mentioned is there's more data coming online all the time. So we have video cameras, you have things that are helping you watch your environment. And one of the challenges we have in this industry and this person who asked the question may not know that they have a lot of that data at their disposal and how it can be used to solve their problem. And that's where we come in. That's where companies like ourselves and Jonathan and them that are trying to look into these problems and provide a better way to do it.
The other thing I'd like to mention on this point, which is apt, is thematically considering the job to be done, right? So if you think about like glue or grease, something people tactily understand and apply it to software, you end up coming up with new solutions. Like, for example, Ellipsis Drive, which is one of our portfolio companies. It's like GitHub meets Dropbox for geodata, sharing, reducing friction, the grease between different workflows and different business units. And in many cases, you also see like glue, right? Where do I want things to stick together and information to be merged, right? We think about unions and joins, things like this, but in general in the enterprise, how do we help geospatial information become attached, become glued to other decisions? So the mental models around glue and grease, I think, can sometimes be helpful to abstract out the very complex technical background of GeoOps into simple things.
So I don't want to overlook too, your position that you're in now, Jonathan, is, kind of in the venture capital world a little bit, like investing in, startups and that sort of thing. I feel like that kind of plays into this idea of, developing technology and changing technology. And I know that when you and I talked, you had just personal experience that kind of led you to where you're at right now. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big frustrations I had as a scientist was the legacy processes and workflows and things people were doing. And it's like, I go back to working on James Webb Space Telescope like 20 years ago. I used to have a pocket protector, believe it or not. I was a nerd back then. And it said, if there's a better way, suggest it. And that's always stayed with me. And that's sort of fueled my entrepreneurial journey. Like, there are better ways to do things. Let's go after them. In geospatial, it was obvious that you could build a system to Google search the surface of the Earth. That's what we did at OmniEarth. And I think for some of these other systems and methods that we're using, we have to think about, well, if you go 500 years in the future and you look backwards, what are all the inefficient, foolish, dumb things people are doing today that we look at? Like, why are they doing it this way? And see if you can affect that change now or move towards a better future with that insight.
And do you have any of the startups that are in your accelerator program? Do any of them focus on taking this idea of GeoOps further?
Yeah, of course, there's some, not everything is done for purely esoteric or egalitarian reasons, right? GeoOps as a concept, I started investing, allocating risk as an investor is really the right way to think about it. I started allocating risk in GeoOps based on what Shay had educated me on in my last company. And so folks like Ellipsis Drive in the Netherlands have built a great infrastructure for decision-making. You have Cognitive Space, who's using gaming engines to make tasking order decisions much more efficient. And then you have a number of, let's say, vertical specific companies using AI and location data for augmented reality and for insurance use cases and like things like that. So it's really GeoOps infrastructure is a thesis to all of my current portfolio investments at Techstars.
Cool. So we actually had a few more questions, so I'll let Matria take those.
Yeah, so here's one question for us. So even two analysts can name the same object different ways. So one could say something is a church, one could say the other's, same building as a town hall, and they both, believe in what they see. How do you build trust within GeoOps?
Oh, that is a great question. As part of my journey as an entrepreneur, before all this AI stuff was cool, we had to create training data by hand, like many of you have done in the past. And it turns out that things like a back porch, something that might be obvious to you as a person who has a back porch, might not be obvious to somebody else who lives in an apartment or has never, seen a back porch. So that gets into semantics, ontologies, and taxonomies, complex ways of using words to describe physical things. The way that it's normally done is through consensus, right? So you can have multiple people measure the same thing. We used to do this, by the way, to prove that our product was better. We would have multiple people in an organization do a thing by hand, drawing boxes on stuff. And then we would show that the variance between those areas was larger than our algorithmic approach. So as a system of trust, what you do is you have to have an agreement about what is truth, right? If you have a training data set that you believe to be accurate, or if you have a consensus-based approach with people or with algorithms, that can be your baseline. And then you can just improve it as a function of time as you learn more, as you get different viewing angles, or as your understanding of truth evolves, right, of a type of building or a type of material over time. There are also frameworks and catalogs like NAEP and other data sets that have been validated over years. So they have long-term trend, right? This is the same thing with like GOES data for weather, or with any of our national assets that are given away for free in multispectral. So that's the thing is, look to long-term trend or use a consensus method. A great company called Arturo.ai for insurance, JC Clark, some of you may know, he's the CEO over there. They use this sort of figure 8 approach where you're constantly validating. So you're taking measurements, you're evaluating against truth, you're updating your truth, you're taking metadata, and you continue that framework. And so it's iterative, right? But at any one time, you have what you believe to be true and what you've measured. So it's always the best way to do it, in my opinion.
We had another one come in also, so go ahead, Mont.
In the last 10 years, a lot of changes we've seen in the geospatial platform, like UAV, GeoAI, automation, scalability, data processing, and more. What do you think are the developments we will see in the future, say in the next 3 to 5 years?
Oh boy, that's Dan. You want to be the futurist on this one? I keep deferring to you and your insights.
Yeah, I'll take this one, but I would love to hear your thoughts too. I think we're touching on it, right? It's about the fusion of those things coming together, really, I think, for the next 3 to 4 years, in particular, and how we're delivering answers based on multiple data sets and how you can fuse those together to get answers, but architect it in a way for individual users who that may be their job, and how do you help them do more with more imagery, with more data. I think that's a part of it. And then as organizations that may not be geospatially aware, but know they have some componentry to it, how they can deploy those kind of things at an enterprise scale. I really see that kind of 2 worlds I look at. I look at the one world where we have all of our geospatial people, they know it. Now they're starting to bring together the tools and the data and answer questions that a lot of us historically have been doing in the D&I business. some of the asset ones we've talked about. But then there's this other world that may be starting to evolve where, press the green button, you hit GeoOps, your data fuses, and boop, there you go. There's the answer you've been looking for that provides you efficiencies. And now your analysts spend more time analyzing than they do building analysis.
Yeah, the way that I like to phrase this, Dan, is you spend more time asking questions of your data than swearing at it.
Yeah. Perfect.
So the other element from a content perspective or data, so we saw in the commercial industry, multispectral imagery become commoditized essentially with the launch of new space technologies and other things for satellite. The next wave is SAR data, which again, it takes a PhD to understand the stuff historically. And then the next wave will be hyperspectral, but that's way far out from commercial adoption. It's mostly a DNI application today. And so that's the wave of data sources. But from a infrastructure technology perspective, it's exactly what you're talking about. You don't know or care about the data source. You care about the answer or the decision that's informing it. So as we move forward in time, I think we're going to see more and more enterprise platforms, things you log into from the web that give you answers rather than opportunities to swear at things, right? Because historically, that's what we were given. We were given the equivalent of the Japanese booth where you smash plates. That was our daily job in geospatial for like a decade or more. Now it's like I roll in with a cup of coffee, hit compile or log in and run my stuff, and I get an answer. And I'm like, this is awesome, right? So I think the future is awesome in this sense.
Yeah, anybody who's in our industry, or if you're on this webinar, first off, thanks for attending, but we live in an exciting time where more and more data is becoming available, and there is pure opportunity to start to assemble these things and answer hard questions, perhaps some easy ones that just haven't been enabled.
Yeah, well, just as an example of that, the easy stuff that hasn't been enabled, think about weather data, right? You go back in time, right? It should be obvious what the weather is or what the temperature is outside. But in the old days, we had to use a farmer's almanac because there wasn't enough measurement points, whether by eyeball or by weather radar or whatever. We're getting ubiquitous data coverage through satellite, drone, ground-based systems, et cetera, and models. And this is allowing us to take things for granted that we couldn't in the past, right? It's really exciting.
Well, we have even more questions. Matria.
We do. Can you speak to the integration of environmental and satellite data to manage an incident as it's unfolding? So for example, blast effects in a toxic cloud that's threatening the community.
Yeah. So this is generally abstracted into what's known as a tip and queue architecture. So you have some assets which are measuring broadly, and then when a signal, any signal, a notification, in this case, like think about H2S or other stuff with sulfur and energy, right? When there's some toxic element, it goes ding, 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 and then what happens? Well, if it's a fire, you call the fire department, right? But in general, with remote sensing, you task other assets to give you a more granular view, more frequent updates, or a better situational awareness about the evolution of this phenomenon. I happen to be in Colorado today. We've been having fires, right? And the original work that I did 15, 20 years ago on unmanned systems was about fire detection and where are the hotspots, where to dedicate your resources in an uncertain environment, allocate your risk. So I think, from a GeoOps perspective, it's about making more efficient the assets that are brought to bear on uncertainty, like this toxic cloud example.
Yeah, just real quick, there's a case study, I'm gonna plug it anyway. There's a great case study on our website regarding in Colorado, I-36, which is a toll road now between Denver and Boulder. And I grew up here, and that bridge has had issues its whole lifetime, right? Once upon a time, trains collided, blew the thing up, they rebuilt it. But not knowingly, the engineering firms built it on some suspect soil. And they should have been monitoring this the whole time, but they didn't. They built it and kind of let it go. And then a couple of years ago, it fell apart, right? And all of a sudden, an already congested area got worse, makes everybody grumpy having to drive in traffic. But with satellite imagery in our case study, you're able to look at and provide a monitoring service that a lot of these infrastructure companies, for the various reasons, probably don't even know they could do. And SAR is one of those data things that I'm totally with Jonathan is going to set the stage, and some of these new things we'll be able to offer industries.
Yeah, I mean, subsidence is a huge issue. I experienced it through my last company in California because of drought, and all of the aquifers were collapsing, right? And people didn't even realize it because the change is subtle, but measurable, right? That's the thing that you alluded to. You look at your eye, you're like, it doesn't seem that different. But if you measure over time, change detection, you clearly see, and then you can model lifetimes of infrastructure and make smart decisions ahead of time, saving tons of money and frustration.
Yeah.
Well, the questions just keep on coming. You're a popular man, Jonathan. Go ahead, Mont.
All right, so the next one here, how can GeoOps handle user access licenses that need to access data and other app components?
Yeah, so this is an important component in a digital cloud-based world, right? We have multi-tenancy, right? Which means I've got an admin, I've got a user, I've got different permission levels, right? This is very common in cybersecurity or DevSecOps or other things. And the same applies enterprise level security and multi-tenancy in a geospatial framework, right? Maybe there's some data that you don't want people messing with, right? And so version control, these kind of things. I mean, you see this a lot, like with OGC standards, Open Geospatial Consortium standards, and with open source software and Git and things, is being able to do versioning and access control so that your system of truth, what you believe to be the right data, doesn't accidentally get changed, right? Because you can see that, like, great example is zonal statistics. Like, you've got parcel boundaries or you've got election boundaries or other things, and like you move it a little bit, and all of a sudden the number of people that you count in different buckets radically can change, or the amount of trees in a forest, those kind of things. So we need to have multi-tenancy and access control metadata as part of that infrastructure for sure.
Go ahead, Mont.
All right. What measures can be taken to enable geospatial information to remain relevant as the underlying source of intelligence versus eyeball analysis?
Ooh, well, relevancy is subjective, right? So I always used to say, if you do the right kind of a system, you'll have the before picture when you didn't know you needed it, right? To do a change detection or a thing. So relevancy evolves, right? Because what's relevant today might be some hotspot in California or Colorado for a fire. But if you have limited resources, that means while you were imaging or taking data of those places, you missed others. And so it really comes down to either having ubiquitous data that's able to be stored and accessed, or making smart decisions and recognizing that if you miss taking data, like RapidEye is a great example of this, again, satellite example. You task the satellite, it was in orbit for decades. You still have lots of places you didn't image, depending on what problem you're asking to solve. So the relevancy is tough. I think it's agree on a baseline, collect that baseline, and companies like Planet Labs and of course USGS and others are taking these background systems, are taking data all the time, and then we have other assets we deploy on the ground or in drones or planes to help augment.
We're on a roll with questions. I'm actually going to have Dan pose some questions because I feel like, for EAS, it was a very short presentation. We had a very short amount of time. What did you not get to that you were curious about?
Ooh, I mean, I feel like I could talk to Jonathan, pick his brain for weeks, and we need a retreat to really go through everything. But one of the things you just brought up made me think of blockchain and the ability, you talked about transparency. What about how do you go back in time to validate perhaps analysis that you did a while back, but now you want to redo and the data is different? Is there an opportunity there?
Yeah, I mean, for those that don't know, I live in Puerto Rico, and there's a lot of these interesting crypto folks bouncing around the island. And so I've had a chance to meet and talk with a number of them and, learned a little bit about the immutable ledger and blockchain technologies and all that. I think that there are many different ways to capture data and its relevance in time, and of course the metadata. Like obviously there's simple things like lat long and reference systems and all of that kind of thing for capturing data, but finding a system of record to track the variation over time. Nobody, I think, has agreed on a standard for that. Maybe that's a call to action for OGC about if, like, again, think about time capsule. If I wake up in 300 years, what is the information that I would want to know about today that would help me to make a better assessment of what's going on for my future self? And I think those type of questions will then create, you could call them requirements or metadata or opportunities to collect and store the most important information over time. Because clearly it's old data on tape drives. Now we've got cloud-based data storage and access, and it's getting easier to store metadata about, scenes or about information that was relevant when it was collected. If it's blockchain, I mean, blockchain is hot. It's a very inefficient database today. Doesn't mean it will change, right? Become more efficient. But for geospatial information, I don't know that there's been an efficient or elegant blockchain solution that's enterprise ready. I would think of Hyperledger Fabric or other things where you could store data, but I'm already happy we have like, GeoJSON and some basic standards for access.
So I actually asked the audience, I did a quick little poll about who wants to hear the harrowing tale of what happened when you're in Puerto Rico with Hurricane Maria. And I think it's interesting because it really had an impact on what you're doing now, which is fascinating.
It fundamentally changed my life. Again, for those that don't know, I had recently moved with my family to Puerto Rico a week before Hurricane Maria. And so a Cat 4 or a Cat 5 hurricane, depending on how you count it, went directly over my house. I was in the eye of the storm for like almost an hour. And my house was compromised with my family in it, basically destroyed. And it was interesting to have a yoga studio and 2 warm Smirnoff ices left over from a kid's party. The alcohol wasn't for the kids, by the way. It was for the adults. But that was all that was kind of left in the house. And I said, what the hell am I doing in my life? And I realized that, 1, it's important to be alive and to appreciate life. 2, your family, right, is critical. So if you're spending a bunch of time working and not with your family, I would ask you to think about your priorities. And then 3rd is community, right? That community building effort post-hurricane, and I was months without power and water and things like this, but it built up a sense of community and helping each other. And I think geospatial as a community is very strong in this regard, right? We are a group of people, like-minded. Our tribe is about using this data that nobody else understands to make informed decisions. So I re-vectored my time and energy to support entrepreneurs and people that wanted to take geospatial information and turn it into better enterprise decisions. I know that sounds very nerdy. I should just be sitting drinking pina coladas on the beach, but when you have the time that you have, you want to use it wisely.
Yeah.
Bravo. Good for you. We need you guys, need people like you in our industry and pushing us and challenging.
See, we need the rebellious spirit. Well,
I gotta up the amount of money I allocate to bar tabs now. I think more people will come.
Yeah.
But I appreciate that. Thank you. It's very kind.
Dan, do you have any other questions? Because we're getting near, we have a few minutes left. Did you have any others?
No, I don't. I mean, I know Jonathan's part of Techstars and Entrepreneurs, and I'm kind of an entrepreneur at heart, having started a couple companies myself and so selling those off. I think it's interesting that there is this, I'm fascinated and hopeful for our industry because I truly believe there's opportunity in our space dripping. And so I guess the question I would leave to you, Jonathan, for the people on this call who are starting companies or who are working for companies that are already in this, how do we push ourselves forward? What's kind of some senior advice you would offer young people on this call?
Yeah. So, young or young at heart. It's all the same to me. My ask is always support entrepreneurship. That could be intrapreneurship inside of your organizations, be they large or small or government or not government. But ask yourself, hey, am I in a position to support the next generation? That could be mentorship. In Techstars, we call it give first. It doesn't mean volunteerism. It sort of used to be called give before you get, but do the right thing for the right reason and support those that are trying to do new things. It's hard, right? And so ask yourself, how many founders are you mentoring, or if you answer their emails, if they call you, how many companies are you working with that are what we would call non-traditional? They're not the big primes or the obvious brand names, they're new. And if you can even find one a year to sort of champion, you'll help move the whole industry forward. Because remember, every big company started as a small company, started as a group of founders, right? Whether it's Harris or L3 or Lockheed or Boeing or any of the big primes or Esri, right? That's an opportunity to be a contributor to an ecosystem of entrepreneurship, even if you yourself are not, quote unquote, a founder, an entrepreneur. Being a support mechanism for that ecosystem is so powerful. So that's sort of my ask. And in exchange for that, please, I will buy you a beer anywhere in the world that I happen to be or that you are and I can find you if you're in that game. So maybe that's a little extrinsic motivation, but probably worthwhile.
Note to self.
Indeed. Thanks, Jonathan.
Right.
Appreciate that.
Well, I think with that, it's that time again when I need to start wrapping up the episode. This was an awesome conversation. As I said earlier, you will receive an email notification as soon as the recording of this episode is ready, and we encourage you to share it. And remember that you can always watch all of the previously recorded geospatial distancing episodes, plus register for the upcoming live episodes at l3harrisgeospatial.com/geospatial distancing. Now, we're going to be back on November 17th for the last live episode of 2020. We'll be doing it sans Matria, which is, I don't know how I'm going to do that, but she's busy. So the full details for that episode, I have not posted those yet, but the registration is available. So if you want to go ahead and reserve your spot for being in that live virtual audience in November, you can go ahead and do that right now at the webpage. So thanks, guys, so much, Jonathan, Dan, and also to Matria for keeping tabs on the Q&A and for you guys keeping a wonderful conversation going. If you'd like to get in touch with Jonathan, you can do that through his LinkedIn or via Twitter at JT Fentzke. Did I get that right?
You got it.
All right. All right, everyone. Well, until next time, I'm going to leave you with a very brief but important directive. Here it is. Vote, and vote now, please. And that's it. I will see you guys next month. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody. See you.
Thanks, Jonathan.